and we're here to talk about thrillers, which is very thrilling. So my first question is, why do you like thrillers? So I will go first. I really like thrillers because my attention span is not very long. And I grew up watching a lot of Law and Order SVU. So I really enjoy the thriller genre because they're usually a quick read with lots of entertainment and twists. And I like being surprised and afraid. Ella, why do you like thrillers?
Well, I actually normally read a lot of horror fiction, and sometimes I'm kind of in the mood for a slower burn, and I feel like thrillers are kind of like what you said. They're a lot of action in kind of a small setting, and kind of true crime because it's real life sometimes leaves me wanting more. So I really like the thriller genre because everything kind of usually is addressed and turns out how I want it to turn out.
Nice.
And I would say that I'm relatively new to the thriller genre as a reader. And so I'm still kind of discovering what I love about it. And just like you both mentioned, it's fun. It's a nice diversion from a lot of what I'm usually reading or usually doing. It's very escapist for me. And as I start to read more and more thrillers, I start to get the hang of like what might be going on. And so it's like a game to try to figure out if I can figure out the twist before the main character can.
Nice. Yeah, I'm always surprised, so I never figure it out.
Yeah.
Which leads me to my next question. What is your favorite thriller? So this is really hard to answer for me because I like a lot of them and they're all so different, but somehow similar. But I would say my favorite one is probably Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. I read it in like 3 days. In one hand, I couldn't put it down. In the other hand, it made me think a lot about like alternate realities and how our decisions can totally change our life. And that's like a decision can be made in like a split second and then your life is different.
Ooh, so it's like butterfly effect type stuff.
Yeah. Sarah, what is your favorite thriller?
So I actually have it back here. I want to show you. I would say it's probably, and this is one I read very recently, it's called The Need. It's by Helen Phillips. And it's very different from a lot of the other thrillers that I've read before. In that, once you do start to read a few, you start to get an idea for like the formula and the pacing and certain elements that you expect to see. This was totally different, and it played into, so I'm a mom of young kids, and so there's specific fears that I have as a mom, specific anxieties that a lot of moms deal with, and that's like what Helen Phillips dives into here. The fears of like losing your kids or, and as you mentioned, like an alternate reality, like what if there's an alternate reality where your kids don't exist? Yeah. And it was super intense and super creepy, and unlike anything I've read like in a long time. So that's one I recommend.
Nice.
I feel like that's a really popular kind of topic with the whole like specific mom fears going on. And I do feel like even if you're not a mom, I read a very similar book, you can still kind of imagine if you were, like that would be a very specific fear that could happen.
Yeah.
For sure.
I would say my favorite thriller is probably Before I Go to Sleep by S.J. Watson, which I do not have, but you can just imagine and it's his first novel, which is wild because it's such a good book. And it's actually on Hulu as well. They just not recently. They made it into a movie a while ago, which I also saw, but it's currently on Hulu. So if you're interested, definitely check that out. But it's almost like a psychological version of 50 First Dates with Adam Sandler, except everything is horrible.
Nice.
I love that as a pitch. Like,
yeah, me too.
That's so great.
The book is very, so it's a woman who wakes up every day and she has the same type of memory issues where she doesn't remember she remembers kind of like a day at a time. So she doesn't remember kind of who she is or where she is, but she starts to leave herself notes, kind of like in
Oh, like Memento.
first dates. They make the little kind of notes explaining her life, and it's very similar like that. Except again, this is kind of the worst case scenario where she doesn't know who to trust, and it's not romantic. It's just awful.
It's not romantic. It's just
not
as cute.
like it's a domestic where she like lives with her husband, but then she doesn't know if it's like her husband. So opposite energy of 51st dates, 51st terror nights.
51st terror nights. Yeah, definitely rename the movie. So Ella, your mention of, domestic life kind of runs into my next question about themes. And I would say my favorite theme, which is like a very big umbrella, is, things are never what they seem. So other than that, what are some common themes in thriller novels that you like best? And I thought we could also delve more into the theme of domestic life and marriage. So Ella, do you want to kick us off?
So very much along the things are not what they seem kind of strain is kind of like this idea that you can't trust the narrator for whatever reason, either like in my book where the narrator doesn't even trust the narrator or some other reason that kind of makes you feel like the narrator is unreliable. And I feel like a lot of thriller books use that as a writing style where you're not really sure who to trust, and then there's an added layer of the narrator doesn't know who to trust, and so you don't trust anybody. So I definitely like that style a lot, although it gives me a lot of good anxiety. And then as far as kind of the broader sense of, what we were kind of talking about with Sarah's book about kind of motherhood, I do think there is a sense of kind of domestic life and marriage as a theme in the book. Like, for example, to jump ahead to a very popular thriller, Gone Girl, it centers around their relationship. Like I said, I've read books. The book I was thinking about earlier was called The Perfect Wife, and it is about marriage and motherhood. So I do think that's really common. I'm not as big of a fan of that just because I have not experienced those things. But I get the concept, and I think that's a great style of writing.
Nice.
So I totally have to steal Ella's answer and say that the unreliable narrator is like one of my favorite devices, because you can do so much with that. You can take that in so many different directions. There's one recently, and it might have been The Woman in the Window, where it's like they don't try to hide the fact that it's an unreliable narrator. Sometimes you don't find out until the end. But this one, I think it's like they put it right up front. You can tell that she's not telling the whole story, or that her story is a little muddy. So it's like, okay, good. Like, I'm not going to fall for this. Like, I'm not going to fall for what you're saying. And then you realize by the end of the book, it's like, but you start to connect with the narrator and you start to sympathize with them. And so you sort of forget that they're unreliable, and you start to see things from their point of view. And then you realize, like, oh my gosh, like I missed this huge clue all along because I was following the narrator's path. So it makes it for some very interesting twists and turns. And plus I just love in general, even outside of thrillers, the whole idea of, telling the same story from different points of view. So it's like sometimes you can do that all from one person's perspective.
I do think there are a lot of books that will tell you up front, hey, the narrator's unreliable, and you're like, I don't trust you any more than I did before, except now I feel stupid for not trusting you.
Yeah.
They really lean into it, and I really like that, but it also kind of makes you paranoid, like, okay, so what are you lying about? Why are you telling me this?
Yeah.
But I have noticed that a lot of books lately are kind of, maybe not lately, maybe I've just read them more frequently, that will take that as kind of like a whole plot point, like, just so you know, you can't trust the narrator.
And that's what I think was so interesting about like the way that it was handled in Woman in the Window, because it's almost, there was some like meta stuff going on, and you had to think about it because, you know that this is possibly an unreliable narrator, but at the same time, nobody else in her life trusts her either. So nobody else thinks she's unreliable. And like, there's a huge, and we can talk about this also, like there's a huge gaslighting, conversation going on in here. And nobody else believes her. So it's like, you want to believe her. You want to believe her because you don't want to be on the side of these other characters that are gaslighting her, but you know that like something's not right. So it puts you in a very, very interesting position as a reader of how much you choose to believe, but very vindicating at the end.
Yeah, and I would say that I like when I just trust them wholeheartedly, and then it just like totally flips.
Mm-hmm.
Being tricked makes me feel a certain way. I think, yeah, one of the main things of a thriller is to make the reader feel like they're on an emotional roller coaster, and you get attached to one character and you're like, oh yeah, I'm rooting for you, you're amazing, but then they turn out to be like a murderous lunatic. And I just think that's so clever because I mean, I don't know, I'm getting an adrenaline rush just talking about it. But yeah, even though, sorry.
I'm sorry. I just had to say that, like, I'm glad you like that because I don't like that at all. I feel betrayed when I trust someone and then it turns out that they're a murderous lunatic. We've gone through 300 pages together.
How could you do this to me?
How could you do that?
Yeah, and even though it is a common theme in thrillers where like the person is like the perfect person, but then they're not, it seriously gets me every time. I think I'm just easily fooled. But I do want to circle back around to the theme of marriage and domestic life in thrillers.
Mm-hmm.
I can see how it's an important theme and why it's so common, because home is where it's supposed to be safe. And it makes you wonder like what really goes on behind closed doors of the perfect couple. And one book that stands out is My Lovely Wife by Samantha Downing. Which is all about this couple. They're like the epitome of a perfect marriage. They have children. They have, he has a job. She's a housewife. It's perfect. They have kids, but the wife is a serial killer. And it's very upfront with that. Like, but we get bored sometimes, and so it's. I just love that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like Sarah, what's your take?
I was thinking about that going into this because, you definitely notice, and I think now more than ever, a lot about wives and moms and that whole domestic sphere.
That's interesting that you both say that because I feel like I have a completely different take on kind of the idea of marriage and domestic life in thrillers. It's also very funny that you talk a lot about kind of like this concept of like the perfect insert, because a lot of the books are like the perfect wife, the perfect child, my little darling, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I have actually read a book, it's one of my favorites, and it is called Behind Closed Doors, and it is about a married couple. But I kind of take kind of thrillers doing more of domestic life as society-wise, it seems to be more acceptable to have a non-traditional family. So this kind of feels like a microscope even more on this illusion that is kind of the traditional family, showing even further that it's fictional. It's, well, in this sense, it's like literally fictional because it's a thriller book, but it's fictional in the sense that like none of this is real. And so to me, that's kind of how I take it. It's an interesting topic to think about.
Yeah. And you get some cool satire in there sometimes too, like, and sometimes pretty overtly. But yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. It's like, and I think Joy, you had mentioned, here's this person that you think is completely perfect and great from the outside, and you don't know, what's going on behind. It's like, yeah, makes you think that if you ever were to meet somebody that you think is too good to be true, they're probably a murderer.
Everyone is a serial killer. Yeah. Everyone has someone in their basement. That's just that's just science.
Yeah.
Sound advice from Sarah. If they're too good to be true, they probably murdered somebody or going to.
Well, that's kind of like that TV show You, where the guy is perfect and then he has people in basements and things like that. So, I mean, that very much does show that there's a trend of this idea of perfection being too good to be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then what they do in You, which like makes me mad also, is that they kind of make you sympathize with him, and he's awful, but then you're like, but like he didn't have a very good childhood and he just wants to be loved, but like you're also murdering people and that's not okay.
But then
I'm not buying it.
thrillers. Like that is the big like thriller motif. Like here's
Mm-hmm.
this person that has this really horrible background. Just kidding, they murder people. And then you kind of have to come to terms with like, well, where do I stand with this person? Isn't it enough that they had a bad childhood and they have this mode of thinking that's not their fault? Or should they have gone to therapy at some point and
Yeah.
maybe not murdered people?
Yeah.
Probably that. I don't think I would make a very good character. I would just like fall for it every time. So earlier we had mentioned suburbia, and I want to shift the focus to the setting of a book. So what is your favorite setting, and how does setting affect the overall book? So personally, I really enjoy settings in suburbia. I think maybe that's because I grew up with a non-traditional family, so like seeing how like the perfect family isn't perfect is like ha, like
I knew it.
so I like that a lot. Makes me think of like Stepford Wives and again, My Lovely Wife, and I'm blanking on more, but I've also noticed like a lot of transition from like suburbia to the countryside or the woods, and like that's usually not a good thing.
Yeah.
But Ella, what do you think about setting?
So I'm gonna admit I don't have a favorite setting. I did think about this a lot, trying to think about what my favorite thriller was and why I like it. And I think a lot of the books that I really like have settings that aren't really set in stone. Like there's something like a town in a nice house, but they don't talk about where they are. And
Mhm.
suburbia is kind of like the blanket, we're in suburbia. But even then I kind of like where they don't get into the setting. Like they don't talk about it. I have no idea where they are. They could be anywhere. And I think I like those books a lot because those books tend to focus on the internal monologue more than where they are. And I think those are really kind of my favorite because you really get into the character's head, literally, because that's all you have in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of help me connect more to the story, so I like those a little bit better.
Yeah, and I felt sort of a similar way about Woman in the Window because it's basically all taking place in her house because she's agoraphobic. And so I feel like the writer did a good job of like conveying that like claustrophobia and agoraphobia. Like you feel like you're trapped in the house with her and it's very limited. And so like you said, a lot of it's going on inside her head and like her monologue and her, you know, her day and her thought process and watching her like classic movies and everything. So I like those very contained settings like that. And then I also like something that's completely like, I wouldn't say out of left field, but not as conventional in the thriller. So we've got My Sister the Serial Killer,
Oh, good.
which takes place in Nigeria, and I feel like the fact that it takes place in Nigeria is very important to the story. I think it's woven in very well because there's a layer of like social commentary and social satire there that I might not have even probably absorbed fully just because, you know, I'm not from Nigeria, but you can tell that that's going on, that she's talking a lot about it being in Nigeria. And it feels like it couldn't have taken place anywhere else. So it's kind of like, in a way, it feels like two ends of this, you know, the spectrum. But I like that. I like the way that you can play with setting like that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that your second book wasn't kind of just like a throw in, like, oh yeah, this is the setting, but that the author really took some time to like weave it into the story. Just because clearly, because we're talking about it, setting is really important. And especially with thrillers, when there's so much going on and the reader's already reading it really closely, you can't just like throw in a setting and not have it be meaningful.
Yeah.
I'm definitely like not all thrillers specify where they are, but some do, and I can't think of anything. The Last Mrs. Parrish takes place in a city, but I forget whether it's London or New York.
I feel like a lot of thrillers happen in New York, and just kind of like stereotypical New York. Like suddenly she was on the street and like so many people were passing and she didn't know where she was. Like, if she really lived in New York, she would know where she was.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the city setting is so interesting because it makes me think a lot about like the bystander effect and how like she's like running away from somebody, but everyone's just kind of going about their own day and like walking by her. And in that way, it's like terrifying because it's like, well, if I was in that situation, would people just ignore me and assume that someone else is going to help me? And that's scary to me, like feeling so lost and helpless.
Yeah,
But
that is like something very primal there, I think.
Yeah.
it also kind of feels like the author is gaslighting you, like just a little bit, because clearly you're very worried about this character and the character is very worried about themselves, but then like no one else in the book is concerned. And so then you kind of feel like, well, am I overreacting to this scene?
Ooh. I also wanted to like lightly touch on like status and all of that because I've found in books like The Last Mrs. Parrish, Verity, I can't think of another one, An Anonymous Girl, like all those things, there's a lot of wealth on one side. Like the man is this very successful, rich man, and it takes place in this giant, amazing house, but either he's psychotic or she's psychotic. So like what's your take on that, Ella?
Oh,
It seems like you wanted to say something.
Sarah, go first. But I definitely agree with you. I do feel like it is always this wealthy character, regardless of it. I feel like in my reading, it's always been the husband, but that's not a motif or anything. And it is always this like wealthy husband. So there's also like a power dynamic that's involved in it. It's not just like, oh, my husband doesn't believe me, but it's also like, not only does my husband not believe me, but I can't afford to leave him because I haven't been working, or I'm a stay-at-home mom, or, you know, all my friends are his, you know, golf buddies. So there is like a power dynamic that makes it really strengthens the unreliable narrative kind of thing going on.
Yeah, and I think it also ties back into what we were saying about like perfection and how it tries that pokes holes in this idea of like perfection and what it means to like have it all, whatever that actually means, which is nothing. But yeah, it also makes me
Yes, bring another book out.
more books. This is one I just finished not that long ago. This is Conviction by Denise Minna, I think is probably how you say it. And you know, there's at least one clear villain in this story, and it's a rich person. I'm going to try to be as vague as possible so as not to give anything away, but a rich person has the ability to like make somebody disappear, go away, and there's also an element of gaslighting to that. And this one dives into like rape culture. There's a lot going on here. But yeah, that person with all that money is painted as a very clear villain because there's this idea that like if you have enough money, you can have it however you want. You can get whatever you want out of life, and that works for a while.
I feel like that's a very fair statement because I do feel like in a lot of thrillers, especially where the main character is not believed, there is a sense of like, well, I've made all these other things disappear and I will pay to make this disappear as well.
Yeah.
So highlighting these books like Gone Girl, Girl on the Train, An Anonymous Girl, what is with all these girls in the book title? And like how do the connotations differ when the buzzword is girl or woman? You know, like the woman in the window, the woman in cabin 10. So I read a couple articles about this topic, and I was surprised to see that a lot of them were positive towards using girl in the title. Right? I was like, and it was NPR and New York Times, and the way that they talked about it was like almost reclaiming the word girl. So instead of being like naive, innocent, dumb, it's more like when someone sees girl in the title, the female character is actually the clever one who's like working the strings. So that made me think a little bit, but what do you think?
Sarah, you go first because you're reaching for something.
Yeah, I was going to show because, like, I think Gone Girl is probably the one that I feel like that's the one that started that trend. And so I don't know how much of it is also like marketing, trying to like latch on to the success of Gone Girl. So there's a little bit of that. But even so, then, you got to talk about why she chose the word girl in the first place. Or if it just sounded nice and cool, like Gone Girl. Yeah.
Gone woman.
Yeah, it just doesn't have the same ring to it. I'm not a fan of the girl, like using the word girl. I never have been, because like you mentioned, it feels infantilizing. And yeah, like you said, I guess you can play with that a little bit and subvert people's expectations if they think they're going to get a book about like, a damsel in distress type of thing, and then you don't get a damsel in distress. But yeah, it just feels weird. It feels weird to refer to a grown woman as a girl. I haven't gotten over it.
I agree.
No, I'm on the same page. Where just, I get the concept. I definitely get the concept of there is kind of a innocence that comes with the word girl. But I guess I'm just like not there yet, where I definitely read the word girl and think like she's innocent, she's the victim, all of that kind of stuff. And I personally would like to see more books with the word woman in them, just because I feel like that's still an issue that we have in our day-to-day lives. Being called, the girls. Like, I don't want to be called a girl. I want to be called a woman.
Yeah.
And I think there is a power in leaning into it, but I think we have to get kind of farther before we can lean back into it, if that makes sense. But that's just my personal.
No, I think that I love the way you explain that, and I completely agree. Yeah, we're not quite ready.
We're not quite ready. Like maybe like somewhere down the line where we have kind of reached that circle, but I think now we're just not quite there yet.
Yeah,
I agree. And I personally like, when I see like Gone Girl, Girl in the Train, I am like, what the heck? Like, why all these girls? And I don't have that same reaction to like Woman in the Window or Woman in Cabin 10. Would authors ever do like The Boy in the Window?
Yeah.
That gives a totally different vibe.
No one is over here saying the perfect boy, the boy in the window, the boy in Cabin 10. Like, we're not playing with that on the masculine side. So I just.
Yeah. And I have to admit, like, it does feel a little eye-rolly when you're like seeing a whole bunch of them, like, because again, when publishers find that formula of like, ooh, people latch onto this works, then you just see like another girl book, another girl book, another girl book. It's like, maybe we could just like try some different naming conventions entirely. Like, just take gender out of it completely.
Gone Person.
Yeah.
That because even the books like The Woman in Cabin 10, The Woman in the Window, like they're always
like where she is, like who she is and where she is. Like, yeah. Very literal.
Yeah.
I haven't read Girl on the Train yet. It's been like on my shelf forever. Have you guys read this one?
I have. I'm sorry.
Movie too.
I'm really excited. Go ahead.
I saw the movie as well.
Yeah.
Emily Blunt is in it, and
I do love her. So
it reminded me a lot of Woman in the Window because the narrator is unreliable. And I don't know. I could talk about the book, but I don't want to give stuff away. But like, yeah, like
tease it.
So well, the premise is this woman is an alcoholic. She lost her job. She rides the train to like make it seem like she's going to work. And she likes looking out the window and like just seeing all the beautiful houses and all that. And when she goes by one house, she thinks she sees something, a crime perhaps. and it's all about, her trying to get people to believe her. So that was very reminiscent of Woman in the Window, I think. Yeah. Was that enough of a tease?
Yeah.
I read the holy trinity of Gone Girl, Girl in the Window, and Girl on the Train, because I feel like those three are kind of like, at least in popular thriller culture, like the top three like novels. And I'm glad that you actually mentioned a little bit of the book Joy, and especially her alcoholism, because I feel like that ties back into what we were talking about before, where there is kind of like a setup for the unreliable narrator. Like, you can believe her, but she's an alcoholic. Or you can believe her, but she's got a mental illness. So there is kind of like the slide in of like, just so you know, do with that information, what you want. But so it's not just like all these people not believing her. It's that, not that any of these are really good reasons, but you can kind of see why they might not believe her.
Yeah, but do you believe her?
Then I get hurt at the end because I believe them, and then
Yep.
killing people. So how can I ever love again?
Yeah, so I guess it's another whole conversation about like how to change girl into something that sits better. That doesn't sound weird, like person on the train.
And it's funny because, when we're talking about that a little bit about, the reasons why a character or a narrator wouldn't be believed, it almost brings me back to your original question, which was, why do you like thrillers? I'm going to be very like open and upfront here and say that I, like many people in America, live with anxiety. And I have heard anxiety described as dress rehearsing for tragedy. So you are going through all these worst case scenarios in your head because you think like, oh, I'm just preparing for the worst. Like, I'm just being practical. I'm just thinking about all these bad things that could happen so that like, I'm ready to like strike if somebody comes for me. But even though it wouldn't work like that, because can you imagine me like striking anybody? No. So I think that as much as it's escapism, it's also like a place to kind of process like my anxiety because, again, especially when you start talking about the ones about motherhood, since I can relate to that, it's working through those fears and anxieties. And in the books, sometimes it turns out like way worse than even I would have like imagined in my own head. So it's kind of a good, I don't know. It's like a good way of having a safe space to like explore those feelings, but I know it exists only in this book and not outside of it. So
yeah, I hadn't thought of that before. Oh, sorry, Ella.
No.
I was just gonna say I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, I too live with anxiety. Woohoo! And I think like looking back on books I've read, yeah, it made me think a lot about anxieties in life and like maybe your partner isn't what they seem, and so that like preys on my fear that my partner is actually a murderer. He's not.
I can probably do that.
That
As far as I know. But in a way, it like helps.
It's like cathartic somehow.
Yeah. What were you gonna say?
So first off, we have anxiety bingo because I also have anxiety.
What do we win?
Circle gets the square.
Thriller books, I guess.
Yeah.
But what I was going to say is kind of on the same lines as Sarah's, that I read them kind of from a different perspective, but very similar, where, as I said before, I read a lot of horror fiction, and one of the things that I can't help but think about when I read horror is, say my house was haunted, or I saw a ghost, or I was possessed, would anyone believe me?
Mm-hmm.
And that is definitely a viewpoint that I bring to thriller, where like, say I actually did see this crime, or did this thing or found out something, like, would anyone believe me? So I do think it is very much an exploration of what you already are not even worried about, but what you already kind of think about. Like, you bring that into the book, and I think thriller is a really good genre where you can kind of explore all the avenues of it, because most thrillers lead you down like 8 different paths before they finish.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. It's like whiplash.
It is
constant whiplash. Yeah. So your mention of horror fiction brings me to the next question about what other genres would qualify as thriller, what differentiates a thriller from sci-fi or horror. Can it be both? And I definitely think they can overlap, because while dark matter is technically sci-fi because it deals with like time travel and alternate realities, I definitely think it's a thriller. But I think the thing that differentiates a thriller from other genres is the intentional deception with a sprinkle of violence or murder. I wouldn't, so
Like a
more
little
um,
old pepper.
um, another book that comes to mind is Brother, and whether or not that would be considered a thriller. But I didn't think there were enough twists, and I think it was extremely gruesome, and it dove more into like the main character's conflict with what the family biz is. So, Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I was also looking into this before because, yeah, it's one of those things where it does have a lot of overlap, especially knowing the difference between horror and thriller. Um, I also, as little as I've read thriller, I've read a lot less horror. I think maybe the one book I would say I've read that classifies as horror is The Shining,
Mm.
which really is as creepy as I think it's creepier than the movie, and it's a pretty creepy movie. But I think horror, it's like the main intent is to scare you, to frighten you. Like that's the goal. And like you said, thriller, like there's that deception. It's like almost like there's a puzzle that either you and or the character, the narrator, is trying to solve. There's missing information. You're trying to put it all together, and there's always going to be that like pow, like climax where you start putting all the pieces together. And of course, yeah, what those pieces come together as can be something that's very like horrible and gruesome and bloody. So they can overlap that way. And then, yeah, I would say that The Need had some sci-fi elements to it because there's that alternate universe thing going on, and there's even some like actual like talk of science and like it was like paleontology. It's been a while. So yeah, that's my rambling thoughts on it.
It's actually really funny that you bring up both those books because I personally would not consider either of them thrillers, and I think why is because when I think of thrillers, I think more of kind of the main genre of the book. So this book is first and foremost a thriller, and it can have a subgenre, like it's a thriller horror or it's like a thriller suspense. But when I think of dark matter, I think of sci-fi and then thriller. And then with Brother, I personally don't consider it a thriller. I would definitely say maybe like horror suspense, potentially, because there is a build-up to the big reveal. And I read an interesting article, and it was about the difference between a mystery, a thriller, and a suspense. And the general gist of it was that a mystery, you're trying to solve this crime, and you're involved, and the main character is involved, and people are collectively as a group involved in solving this. Whereas a suspense, something is happening, and you may or may not know what it is, but the main character doesn't usually know what it is. So they are definitely in the dark. You may or may not be in the dark, but you're building towards something that happens. And then a thriller is someone's in danger right from the get-go, and people aren't trying to solve it, but usually it's the main character that's in danger. And again, you may or may not know kind of some of the background information, but thrillers, most likely you don't know what's happening. You know as much as the main character does. And then sometimes it's like revealed at the end. So I would definitely say unless it's something like Gone Girl, where I couldn't, I'm pretty thriller purist. Like it's a thriller and it's nothing else.
Huh. Interesting.
And just to comment on horror, since I read a lot of it, I would say that horror does have a lot of like subgenres, like horror paranormal and horror suspense. But horror at the end of the day is kind of like this almost step back from the rules of society. You know, whether it's something really gruesome happening or something paranormal, it is a step back in usually a very terrifying way that is different from like fantasy or sci-fi or something like that. It's still usually, unless it's paranormal, within the human spectrum.
Wow. I also feel like horror like delves more into like the human psyche a lot more.
Yeah.
And like, you know, your inner demons. And like, who are the real monsters, you know?
And the other thing with horror that kind of goes back to that article I read is that thriller from the beginning, you usually know the main character's in trouble. Horror, you don't always know that from the beginning.
Mm.
Also, the main character might be the cause of the trouble. Like, in thriller, usually they're the victims sometimes, like most of the time, and then sometimes they're not. But horror really is something's happening. Oh, just kidding, there's blood everywhere. And you don't really know who's the victim and who's like doing it. And usually, yeah, the main character is the one that's behind it all.
Yeah. I also I don't read a lot of horror, but I watch a lot of horror movies. And they all like have this theme of like, I love the beginning where like everything's happy and in the sun.
No.
Yeah, but then it gets dark and freaky stuff starts happening. I think that was related. Yeah, that's pretty related. And I feel maybe the books are the same way, where like everything's fine until your lights shut off or something.
I like, Ella, how you mentioned that like in thriller, it's like the cards are all on the table from the beginning. You know that like you're in trouble because the first line of My Sister the Serial Killer is, Ayula summons me with these words, Correde, I killed him. I had hoped I would never hear those words again. Like, boom, you're in it.
You already
He killed him, or she killed him.
know.
Yeah.
Someone died right off the bat.
Yeah.
Well, and the title kind of like puts it all out there.
Yeah, like there's no question.
Right, which I like because it did intrigue me, and like the cover art's beautiful, and but the title too, I was like, ooh. Like,
It's such a cute little like pocket book, like such a little like boom thriller.
I don't think it was long enough, but that's just me.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about like endings?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think endings, sometimes it's great, but sometimes it just feels like very rushed.
Yeah.
Do you guys like when they wrap up neatly and you kind of know what happens, or do you like better when you don't really know and you kind of know, but you're not really sure?
I think it depends, because I think sometimes you can do that like ambiguous ending really craftfully, and sometimes it just feels like rushed or just like abrupt. So I think that's a really hard line to like, try to balance. But yeah, I don't necessarily prefer one or the other, just as long as it's done really well and it feels satisfying at the end.
Yeah, I like the ambiguous endings, but with like a hint of like definitive answers, if that makes sense. Like, well, I don't want to give away any endings, but yeah, okay, I can't think of anything without giving away things.
All right, I read a book, which I'm not going to say the title. And it was a husband and wife, and this book title, which I will not mention, did a really good job of giving them both good kind of character building, even though the wife was the main character. And at the end, she revealed that she knew that he was behind it and that she was going to get him arrested. And the book ended at them standing together and her being like, the cops are on the way. And even though it didn't like completely end all the way, because what if he ran away? What if he like said, he was going to buy them off or something like that? You at least kind of felt secure that like it was an ending-ish. Like it was enough of an ending where like she had an escape plan, and it seemed like it would be the end of the book.
Yeah.
For me. I don't know if that's what you were talking about, Joy.
That is, yeah.
Awesome.
Or just like, I can only think about horror movies because like, I don't know, I don't want to give away the ending of a book, but like when there's like someone is accused for the ghosts or whatever, or no, accused of a crime because of ghosts, but then the camera like pans over and like you see all the ghosts and like it was really the ghost, but no one believes them. So it's like, ooh, it's like ending, but like, yeah.
Classic, the shot of like the zombie hand coming up out of the grave, like, and then cut to black, like the end.
Mm-hmm.
It's the whole the end, or is it kind of game.
Exactly.
But I think that's really fair because there is a sense of like victory where, especially in a book where the narrator's not believed, that even if there's still this huge fight ahead of them to be believed, there's one person out there that maybe witnessed it, that saw that like, no, they're telling the truth, or at least now that they're reliable.
Yeah.
And even if the book doesn't continue with the joyous ending of them being believed, like you feel satisfied that you know that they were believable.
Yeah. I also can't think of like, so in that same vein of like endings and ambiguity and stuff, I can't think of any thrillers that are like a series. Maybe you? That's like a series, right? I haven't read the books. I've only watched the show, but
I haven't read a lot of thriller series, to be honest. Personally, I tend to read a lot of standalones, and I do feel like the ones that are series, at least in my personal opinion, tend to lead towards more mystery, because then there's something that's going on that more and more people are trying to like solve. I can think of very few thrillers where something is happening to the main character and it's happening over many, many books.
Yeah. Because I think part of it is like the pacing is what makes it a thriller. So like the pacing and the packaging of like, you know, that there's some type of like boundaries around the story, essentially. Like you said, it doesn't go on forever because you can't keep repeating the same tricks over and over again because it's not thrilling anymore. So
yeah, I definitely prefer the standalones because then like it's over.
Is that something that is more likely to happen in the thriller genre, that they are standalone novels? I'm not saying there aren't thriller series, because there are, I'm sure, tons of them, but I personally do think that one of the nice things about a thriller is that it's a book and it ends. Whereas horror, which we talk a lot about, I talk a lot about because I really like horror, you can have that kind of like, and then the murderer's son, and then the ghost returned, and that you can kind of make more of a series of it, whereas thriller is like, all right, all this action, and then we're done.
Yeah, I don't think readers necessarily care about, if that makes sense. Like, I don't want to be insensitive to the characters, but it's like, okay, like you're fine, or like you're not fine, and that's it. I'm done with you.
it's over. That's enough.
Yeah, like I don't think I would read like another Gone Girl. So it's like, where do you go? You already know.
Even her other books, I think, are standalone thrillers too, right?
They are, yeah. It is Dark Places, Gone Girl, Sharp Objects.
Okay.
I did kind of want to touch on like movie and TV adaptations. Do they ruin the book? Do they enhance the book? Personally, when I see the movie first and then read the book, I don't like that I already have a picture of who the character is. I like making my own character. But like sometimes I do like when I have a character in mind, because I picture like Neil Patrick Harris in Gone Girl, and like
wild casting choice.
Yeah, I think the casting in Gone Girl is really good, and I liked that movie adaptation a lot. But Ella, what are your thoughts?
So I want to start by that I have a theory, and it's that there's a spectrum, and every book falls along a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum is Fight Club, where it was a really good movie and a really not great book. And I say that with so much respect to Chuck Palahniuk. But the book was just, I feel like, too much. And the movie narrowed it down where it was really good, and you got what he was saying without the rest of the book. And then on the other hand of the spectrum is World War Z by Max Brooks. And that was a really good book and a really bad movie, because nothing about the movie had to do with the book. So that's where my spectrum is. So I have seen Gone Girl, and I've also seen Before I Go to Sleep. And I think both of them were so good and so close to Fight Club, which is the only scale that I'll ever use. Because both of them, I saw Gone Girl before I read the book. And the book was so good that even though I knew what happened in the movie, I still was surprised by the book. Even though I knew what was going to happen, I still was turning page by page the book. Like I was still really caught up in the book.
Yeah.
And Before I Go to Sleep, Before I Go to Sleep the book, I read the book and then saw the movie. And the movie did it justice. The movie was really good. So both of those really hold up.
Is it Nicole Kidman in the movie? I think it's...
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was a good...
And she did a great job. Just a really good portrayal. So I think it's really hard, because the part about a thriller that's so thrilling is that you don't know what's going to happen. So I think it's really difficult to make a really good thriller movie based on a book and choose which one you're either going to read the book or see the movie first. But I think both of them did a really good job.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like we had talked about before, where, you know, a thriller is in the pacing of the book. I think that's why the adaptations can be so difficult, because you have to hit every beat just right, I think, to keep that flow and that suspense and that thrill. And of course, when you're adapting into a movie, you have to make some tough choices about what you're going to cut. And are you going to cut the right things, that it all kind of like ties back together in a similar way, because yeah, you still want that like pow at the end. Pow. I would say, though, probably Gone Girl is the only one so far that I've read and seen. And from what I remember, because it's been even longer since I've read and seen Gone Girl, that I would agree. I think it captured like the tone of it really well. And didn't like Trent Reznor do the soundtrack or something, like, which seemed like a really good fit? Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
Worked out.
I also saw Girl on the Train, which I liked, with Emily Blunt. It's been a while, but yeah, I'm wondering too, like, producers must have in mind that like their viewers are going to be people who read the books. And, you know, sometimes I feel like people who read the books see the movies to be like, ha, you didn't include this very tiny detail in the book, and that invalidates your movie.
I mean, I do hope some of the people viewing this like have good recommendations, because I will say that those are the only two thrillers that I've seen / watch. So if anyone watching this has some good thrillers that they've either read and then seen the movie, or seen the movie and then read the book, like, I'd be really interested in some recommendations. There's nothing to do now but watch TV and read.
Yeah, me too.
And process our anxiety.
And process visually, we can see it. But yeah, I mean, I also think one of the biggest merits of thrillers too is like processing it without a visualization of it, because it's your own mind, your own creepy mind.
Mm-hmm.
My own creepy mind.
The collective creepy mind.
Yeah.
Creepy minds. But I also just enjoy movies too. So like, yeah. I also, when I see the movies, I don't like, I think of the book, but I'm not like dissecting the movie.
Yeah. And sometimes like you're not in the mood to read a book, which is blasphemous as a librarian, but like sometimes I just don't want to read the book.
Yeah.
Like, it happens. Sometimes I just want to passively collect the information. And so in that case, I'll watch the movie, and then like maybe later I'll read the book. But maybe I won't.
Like to live on the edge.
Like to live like risky.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. All right. So let's say you have a patron come up to you that is new to thrillers. What is your go-to recommendation?
Imagine Sarah just walks up to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Thrill me.
Really? Well, I mean, if it were you and you've already kind of listed some thrillers that you've read, since you mentioned, I want to say it was called The Need.
Yeah.
It was a book about motherhood. If you have not read The Perfect Wife, I would definitely recommend that one, because it was still about motherhood. It is about a woman that has kind of like a mommy group, and her child goes missing. And so there's like an extra level of her being judged as a mother.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like, well, did someone kidnap her child? Did the child, did she not take care of the child? Like, there's a whole level of like kind of motherhood that's in question in addition to the thriller. And then it turns out to be kind of your thriller ending, where she's not a bad mom. But it was really good. But I would say if someone came up and they were just like brand new to thrillers, had never read a thriller, I mean, Gone Girl is a classic at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would be a good place to start for somebody who, because that was my first thriller too. I think that's a really good like entry into it. And then I think I might even put like Woman in the Window as like a step 2. Like, if you've done Gone Girl, you would like, because it builds on that, like what Gone Girl brought to the genre, I think. And then if you're looking for like a step 3, then I can start to throw in some of the like, wackier, more unexpected ones.
Yeah. I the last time someone asked me about thrillers, I recommended Woman in the Window first.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think reevaluating Gone Girl, and then you just like go down the rabbit hole. But I also like that's when I also get my chance to be like, do you know about Novelist, our resource? Because if you read if the person is like, okay, so like I read this book that I think is a thriller and I really liked it, or I heard about this book, you can bring up the resource and like find read-alikes. And that's why I love that resource so much. And I always talk it up because that's how I've built my thriller repertoire is like, I really like Gone Girl. What should I read next? Oh, Girl on the Train. Okay, I really like Girl on the Train. What should I read next? Or like, I want to read a book where there's a perfect couple and then, all the results come up. And, Novelist is directly connected to our catalog. So you can see what we have and what we don't have.
Yeah. Well, the thing I really like about Novelist too is one, it's a public resource. So it's not some like weird librarian knowledge that we have. It's on our website. You can access it on our website. But two, it gets really specific about why it's recommending the book.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm recommending this book, like Gone Girl, because it's not only a thriller, but it also deals with a married couple. Or I'm recommending this because it's a thriller and it's fast-paced and it's a female narrator. And so it'll get like really specific.
It's like the Netflix categories.
Yeah, like it just gets really specific about why it's recommending it, because sometimes when you read a book, you don't know why you like it. You're just like, maybe.
It was good.
And then you kind of are like, oh, actually, now that you mention it, I would actually really like that.
Mm-hmm.
But also we have the Next Reads newsletter on our website too, and there is a thriller and suspense category as well. So if people want emails with suggestions, that's also linked to our catalog. And I'm signed up for the thriller and suspense, and then there's also a horror one. So I get that one too. And that's really good because I just passively add them to my to be read list.
Yeah. I need to sign up for that. I also had this thought just popped up, and I probably should have brought it up like 4 questions ago, but I have never read or seen an LGBTQ plus thriller.
Oh, that's a good point.
I wonder if we're going to get slammed by viewers, though, that are like, how could you not have heard of?
Yeah.
I know, but
Tell us.
I'm admitting it. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, no.
Because what? Sorry.
No, like I'm just like muttering. I'm like muttering in the corner to myself. Like, you're right. I'm blanking, which is awful.
Because I do sometimes tire of the same like formula of like the perfect couple, and they're not perfect, or like the perfect house, but something's freaky about it, or like a lot of the couples are hetero. I've never read a same-sex couple thriller or a person who identifies any other way. So I just kind of like, are there any out there?
I'm sure. I also am really interested because I feel like I can think of potentially mysteries that are LGBTQ, but just like the pure thriller genre, I would eat up recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you have a recommendation, comment.
Don't let me keep living like this.
Yeah, exactly. I feel a bit like ashamed that I don't know, but yeah, but I am very open to learning.
No, me too. Good call.
Thank you. So this brings me to our final question, which is, what are some thrillers you are excited to read but haven't gotten to yet? Let me think. Oh yeah, so I have heard a lot about The Family Upstairs by Lisa Jewell, and it keeps popping up on like all the lists I look up, and I just haven't read it yet. The premise is something along the lines of this person was adopted, and then they look into who their biological family is, and it's all tied into this one house. But then there are other, like their siblings who were also adopted out, find out their biological roots, and they all come to this one house, but like there are very dark secrets in this house. So I'd be really interested to read that because I'm all about like family dynamics and like that kind of thing. And I would also really want to read In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware.
Yeah.
Because I really liked The Turn of the Key. And so I forgot what the premise of that one is, but that's definitely one I want to read. And then finally, this one's a new one. It came out this year. It's called You Are Not Alone by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen. And they wrote An Anonymous Girl and the Wife Between Us, which I really liked. And the premise of that one is, what is it? There is a woman and she's at the train station and she just witnesses someone jumping in front of the train.
A lot of trains.
Yeah.
a lot of trains. They're fast moving, a lot of people. You see stuff. But then she finds this group of women who seem to have it together, and she joins this group. But then, it probably will all go wrong. I forgot to mention one of my favorite books, The Silent Patient. And that's like a whole can of worms. And it's so good. And I loved it. And it falls under that, talking about mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And it has all the the murder and the unreliable narrator. And it just, I don't know. I just want to throw that in. I think, Sarah, you read it, right?
I did, yeah. It had me thinking about a point I was going to make earlier about the difference between like how men and women write their characters in thrillers. And almost all of the books I think that we've mentioned are written by women. And I think it makes sense for like how those themes are fleshed out. Woman in the Window is an exception.
I'm going to say, yeah.
Yeah. And I would say I was pretty pleased with how it came out, like, because it just can have a whole conversation about how it's hard for men to write women. But I think AJ Finn pulled it off better than Michaelides, is that the last name of Silent Patient? It was a little more obviously written by a man.
So do you have any other final thoughts or recommendations?
Well, I want to talk about the books that I want to read.
Okay. Oh my God. No, Ella, I don't care. You said you.
The reason I'm annoyed about it is because Silent Patient, I've been on the wait list for that for a long time. I'm just waiting for it to come in, and I'm very excited to read it, and you both have read it, and I have not. So I also know that Nick has talked about it in our Twitter book chats, the hashtag PDCMLS book chat that happens at 12 o'clock on Thursdays on Twitter. Nick has talked in depth about it as well. And every time I hear someone has read it and loved it, I just feel a little spike in my heart.
Oh man. What else do you recommend? Or what else are you excited to read?
I have tunnel vision for that book.
It's been so long.
I know. I need like a support group for people that want to read The Silent Patient but have not yet. But no, I've actually also want to read Into the Water, which is by the same author as The Girl on the Train. I'm also on the wait list for that, but I have been waiting less time. So that doesn't hurt in my soul as deeply as
less
The
bitterness
Silent Patient. Less bitterness, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was all I had.
So that concludes our thriller book chat. Thank you both for joining me. I had a lot of fun talking about my favorite genre.
Yeah, thank you for having us. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I had a great time.
And I can't wait to hear what all the suggestions are that everybody comes up with for us.
So we can
I cannot wait.
Yeah.
All right.
That's how excited I am. I have to cut everyone else off. I can't wait.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
See you next time.